Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for office hours. I'm Lynette Kalsnes, and I'm the Communications Director here at the ACLU of Minnesota. And with us tonight are Jana Kooren, who is our Engagement Director, and Ismael Dore, who is one of our great organizers. And I'm going to turn it to them to have them introduce themselves and each tell you a little bit about their work. So Jana, if you could take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Jana Kooren. Like Lynette said, I'm the Community Engagement Director at the ACLU, and I have the great pleasure of doing work and kind of working with people in the community and making sure that folks who are affected by our issues, people who care about our issues, get to be involved in advancing our issues, whether that be at the Capitol or down to your local city council level and all sorts of areas in between. And I'll turn over to Ismael to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Ismael Dore. I'm the organizer with the ACLU of Minnesota. My work is centered around voting rights. I'll be partaking in trainings with organizations like Minnesota Voice to, work on efforts to increase voter turnout within the communities. As we all know, there's a pandemic going on, and a lot of people's right to vote is actually currently being threatened. So we have to make sure we preserve that right. Can't hear you.
Oops, thank you. I'm unmuted. I have a lot of topics to cover tonight. We're going to talk about voting rights, the racial and cultural impacts of what we're seeing with COVID-19, protesting and organizing, the census, and youth rights, and of course, all the questions that you are sending our way. Some of these are questions that you've previously submitted, but you have a chance tonight to keep sending us more on Facebook. So just throw them below this event and we'll be looking at them throughout the night. And we'll start up with a question right away for Ismael on voting rights. How can every Minnesotan make sure their vote counts in the upcoming election? What barriers to voting still exist? And what can we do to solve these problems before Election Day?
Can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, Minnesotans can make sure their votes count by planning well ahead of Election Day. This would mean exploring options like early voting, absentee voting, and taking advantage of one of those options. During a situation like a global pandemic where many of us are asked to stay home, it would be ideal, you would think, that everyone exercises their right to vote the smart and safe way, which would be from home. And despite what you may have heard, it is perfectly legal to vote absentee through the mail. It is also without doubt that there will be more barriers to voting due to COVID-19. For example, times like this, it gets a bit harder to find a signature for your absentee ballot. And for an absentee ballot, you would also need to request that ballot. It will not be automatically mailed to you, which could lead to more people needing to risk their lives and their health to go stand in line to vote in person. Also, in order to register to vote or to request an absentee ballot, you will also need to prove your identity, which would mean having a driver's license. Currently, the DVS is closed, so people without a license or an ID are currently in the struggle with that, but hopefully the DVS will open up soon here. You'll also, or you might need the last 4 digits of your Social Security. We also want to make sure that everyone who votes in person is safe while they are voting in person. It's possible we could have barriers to access to masks, gloves, or other personal protective equipment that would be necessary when voting in person.
And I would just add to that, right? So the different, you can use all sorts of different sorts of identification in order to either request a ballot or to register to vote. And so, right, Ismael talked about it could be harder to get a driver's license at this point if you need to use that for one of your forms of ID. And everything is taking longer to get right now, and you don't want to have to go and track down all the different places you might need to either get the bill you need or anything like that.
Great. I know I am personally going to avoid the mess they had in Wisconsin, and I absolutely will be getting an absentee ballot. And Noble is our producer here tonight, and I've asked them to put that message for everybody, that link for everybody, to make it really easy. If you want to vote absentee, you'll be able to see the link on our Facebook chat. So next up, we are wondering, So people are worried about voting and potentially endangering their health because of COVID-19, of course. So what are we here at the ACLU of Minnesota doing to make sure people can vote? And I'm going to toss that to Jana.
Sure. So there's a number of things, right? Ismael talked about how important it is for people who are able to vote through the mail, through our absentee voting process. So one of the things that we're going to be doing, not only myself, Ismael, and other organizers who work at the ACLU, is doing voter outreach and education to make sure people know about their voting options, right? That's one of the most critical things. And we want to make sure people know this and know this ahead of time, because it takes more time when you're voting through the mail, right? When you have to request your absentee ballot, you have to wait for it to come, you then have to submit it. And we'll be doing regular outreach and education, obviously virtually right now, to make sure people are aware of this. We're also doing things like we're having conversations with the Secretary of State to make sure that they are meeting their obligations to ensure all eligible voters can and do vote. We're also looking at problems as they arise to see if we need to file a lawsuit, right? The ACLU is known for doing our great legal work. And just in the last couple of years alone, we filed a number of lawsuits around voting access. So we'll continue to explore that option. If the legislature comes back in session, we'll also continue to look and see, are there things we should be pushing for and advocating for at the legislature as well? So we're really trying to tackle this problem on a number of fronts.
Now we know the legislature just finished, of course, and could come back in special session like Jana's talking about, but at least at this point, the legislature did not get a full vote by mail bill passed this session. So we do have these wonderful no excuse absentee ballots, and that means people can vote early in person. So Ismael, why don't you explain to us how that will work?
I got to remember to unmute myself. While anyone should be able to access voting in person, it would be safer for public health if most people voted at home through our absentee voting system. You can vote early either through requesting an absentee ballot or by visiting an early voting location. The safest way for everyone, however, is to just vote absentee from home. Don't risk going out to the polls where you could potentially be at risk for COVID-19. The safest way, like I said, would be from home. You don't need to be registered to apply, and the ballot itself can be turned in 46 days before the election day. So you have good time to, think about the candidates who you want to vote for. But the most important thing is making sure that absentee ballot gets turned in ahead of time, and that you give the election officials time to process the ballot. So any ballot received after election day will not be counted. So it's really important that if you're voting absentee, you do it early as possible. And it's also important to know, it's also important to know you will need a witness to sign your ballot. And that person must be a registered voter, or they should be a notary.
Yeah, and generally much easier for us to find a voter, right?
Yeah.
And again, that's as soon as 46 days before election, you can vote early, or all the way up through election day, but they've got to get it on that date.
Correct. Anything received after election day will not be counted. So it's super critical to turn that in. And if you are worried about getting to the mail, like let's say you realize it's the Saturday before election day, you can go to voting locations and drop it off in person if they have in-person early voting. And in the days leading up to election day, you'll find there more and more in-person early voting or places you can vote early around the state. So if you do want to vote in person, because maybe you're homeless, you can't get an absentee ballot sent to you, maybe you only have a PO box because you're Indigenous and you live in a community that doesn't have a physical address, and so you need to vote in person. If you are worried about a long line or crowds on election day, you can vote early in person as well, and you can check your local county election website in order to find out where are the locations where you can vote early.
Now that Jana and Ismael mentioned our lawsuits, we have one currently that is working to extend voting rights to people who have felony convictions, who are not in prison, they're in our community on probation or parole. And so Jana, can you fill us in on the status of that lawsuit?
Yeah, happy to do that. So right now it's in Ramsey County District Court's hands. And right now we're at what a legal technical definition is a cross motion for summary judgment. If you're not a lawyer, just like me, I'm not a lawyer, that basically means both sides have asked the court to actually rule on the case, right? Summary judgment kind of means like almost like the end of the case. And so both the state of Minnesota and the ACLU has said, give us a decision in this case. We've presented the arguments and we expect that decision by August. We're hoping the court will rule sooner than that. So we have time, if we are victorious in the case, to register and get all those people to vote, but it could be as late as August before we actually get a decision from the Ramsey County District Court. So right now it's just a waiting game for us. But in the meantime, we are going to be working to make sure that people who are either on probation or recently have completed their probation know whether or not they're eligible.
Yeah, we don't want there to be any question about that at all. And we'll be doing so much work to encourage people to vote. You know, whether we do it early or we decide to stand in line, it's, as always, it's a really important election, right? And we want to, our right to vote is fundamental. We will be exercising it. So before I move on to some of the racial and cultural impacts we've seen with COVID, just want to remind people that you can put questions on our Facebook page. And if you have other voting questions for us, we'll circle back with you. But we're going to move back and, oops, a little note for Jana that we should talk about some of the efforts that have been happening to suppress the vote. Jana, can you fill us in a little bit about that?
So yeah, so voter suppression has long been a problem in the United States, which probably doesn't come most as a shock if you're tuning into the ACLU's Facebook live stream, right? You probably have heard about efforts in other states to restrict voting by limiting the number of days people can vote early, by requiring an ID to vote, all sorts of efforts. And I think some of what we saw in Wisconsin and in other places that we're worried about now is if we consolidate polling locations, because elections officials want to have less election judges working or whatever the reason may be, then we could be seeing really long lines, right? And people being put more at risk or worrying about being able to access the vote, or people getting discouraged because they've been waiting in line for 2 hours and so they leave, right? That's tactics that have happened in other places, or even misinformation from people in government, right? Every state has a different election system. And sometimes there are also deliberate misinformation campaigns that make people think they're not eligible or able to vote in a certain way, even when they are. So it's really important for folks to recognize that we have a good voting system here in Minnesota. You can vote absentee by mail. You should always go through websites like the Secretary of State to get your information from, because we've also seen tactics in the past where people get mailers that look quasi-official, that may mislead people into thinking their right to vote is in jeopardy. And I wouldn't rely on information you see just anywhere or on Twitter. Go to a trusted source to find out information, like the Secretary of State's office. That's where I'd recommend.
Yeah, the Secretary of State's office is great because you really can check to see if you are registered, and also find absentee ballots and all kinds of other stuff. So, and we're going to talk about the racial and cultural impacts. So there's a ton of evidence that COVID-19 is infecting and killing Black people at higher rates than white people. So why is this, and how has this impacted the work of organizing in Black communities? And Ismael, can you take this one?
As we know, Black communities are at a greater risk to COVID-19 due to historical and racial disparities. Black communities have a larger population of low-income individuals compared to white communities, as well as multiple socioeconomic factors such as lack of resources, access to education, misinformation, healthcare, government resources. Across many of those Black communities across the country, we know underlying conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, hypertension, heart disease, and asthma are statistically predominantly higher in Black communities as well. We have many Black and people of color in the service industry who make up a large portion of what we call today essential workers. And as we all know, the essential workers are the brave ones risking their lives every day to keep things together for everyone during these times. They're the ones more likely to contract the virus by putting their livelihood at risk by going to work every day. So that, along with the socioeconomic factors that Play previously mentioned, do some barriers in and of itself. But this means when I'm doing my work this fall, where I want to target Black communities for voter outreach, I'll have to take a new approach. We know these communities have historically a low voter turnout, which is why it's even more critical now than ever to get these people in these communities at the table, making sure their voices are being counted for.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and Jana, what are some of the other things that we'll be doing at the ACLU of Minnesota to kind of address and change these disparities?
So one of the things we've done is we joined with other ACLUs to really demand that we have better data kept on the true extent of our racial disparities. So if you go into the COVID tracking dashboard put up by the Department of Health, you can see some data. You can see infection rates and mortality rates broken out by communities of color. But there's a lot of gaps in the data that's on there. For example, there's a huge percentage of people that are unknown. We also don't know the race breakout for a small individual location. So as we look at communities like North Minneapolis, which tends to have higher rates of things like asthma and anything else because of the systematic racism in putting things like, you know, different coal power plants or garbage processing plants there, we can't break it out to a granular level. And we're also not knowing things like race breakout by how you're contracting it, right? Because as Ismael pointed out, we know that people from Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color communities are more likely to be essential workers. So one of the things we did do is we asked, you need to start tracking this, and from there we can at least break out into some more set of recommendations. And in addition, you know, we didn't get a response from the governor after that letter, so we are following it up with a more formal data practices request where they do have to send us information that they have on this. And we also want to know what the plans are of the governor so we can work with folks to find even better solutions. For example, in Wisconsin, there was free testing they set up in communities of color and Black communities where they were the hardest hit, and other things like that, that could be recommendations based on where we're kind of seeing the hardest hit areas. For example, we know Worthington is a huge a hotspot for COVID and has been because of the meat processing plant, and a lot of the people who are getting sick and who have COVID down there are people who are from immigrant and communities of color.
Jana, you had mentioned that we've been pushing to track the disparities in COVID infection and testing and things like that. I know had asked for that level at a county level. Have we gotten that yet?
We have not gotten the information broken at the county level, which is one of the things we're following up for in a formal data practices request. I know that other news stations have reported sometimes on the county level, but the state is not putting it on their website or in a way that's accessible to everyone in the public, where you could break it out and look at it and try to dive deeper into what some targeted solutions may be.
Yeah, it's really hard to even come up with solutions, right? If you can't figure out where the hot spots are and then start winnowing in or going in on what's causing them.
Yeah, and we already know that there's so many communities that are hurting, right, as well. So I'd love to see also, we're pushing the governor to be more proactive, right? Yes, you need to get the data, but we already know that there are some areas, and we want to see a better response for the areas that have been identified as well.
Great. And we've talked about some of the disparities that are happening, of course, in terms of inspection and testing and things like that. Enforcement tends to fall heavily in our Black and Brown communities too, unfortunately. What is your team doing to make sure that the stay-at-home order that just recently got lightened up did not disproportionately affect those communities?
So first of all, we're asking for regular collection and analysis of the citations for the stay-at-home order. In addition, we are monitoring all arrests at the stay-at-home order as well. So far to date, there's been less than 100 arrests by our last account, which is still a lot, but it's still not. It's a number that has not grown substantially. And right now, race data is not actually being reported along with that. So as of right now, we don't know the full extent to the breakout of a disproportionate impact on communities of color because they're not collecting it. Like I said, we've asked for them to collect it, but in the data we've seen so far, they have not released that information, or they have not started collecting that information as well. In addition, because of our organizers like Ismael and other ones who were on previous lives you may have listened to, we also are just waiting and listening for people who come to us with stories of this enforcement. People, if you yourself have been targeted for the stay-at-home order, arrest in a problematic way, you can also go to our website and fill out a complaint for our attorneys to review.
Great. And our website is ACLU-MN.org, and there's an area on the button that's essentially legal assistance. It takes you right to a form. It just takes a couple of minutes to fill out, and that's actually how the Moose Lake case that we have dealing with prison conditions during COVID, how we're actually hearing from lots and lots and lots of inmates and their families. So please, again, that link is www.aclu-mn.org. And you want to look for the Request Legal Help button. So we're moving on to protesting and organizing. Again, folks, if you've got questions, put them in Facebook for us. And we have seen in-person protests around Minnesota during the pandemic. Jana, what are the balances that need to be struck?
So any restrictions on our constitutional rights have to be grounded in science and in public health, and taking into account, what the Constitution says. And so right now we need to continually reassess what the restrictions are based on what we know, right? So the same rules that may have been laid out 4 months ago or 3 months ago or 3 weeks ago, especially as we go along in this, are not necessarily the same ones that need to happen all the time. We know that through the powers of the emergencies orders and stay-at-home orders, we do know that there can be some restrictions, but they need to be looked at all the time to make sure that they are still needed at the same level that they previously had been. And regardless, there are always ways that people can show up and use activism that does not have to be an in-person protest, right? You can voice your protests and use your freedom of speech in other ways aside from just showing up physically in one space, right? So we've seen people driving by a place and honking, right? You can generate calls. There are other ways that we still are using, especially as advocates like us who are pushing for some changes that don't risk health by showing up in person.
Great. So we've talked about some of the tools that we're using in various ways, but what are the tools that you guys are using as organizers and activists right now to advocate for change from home? And then if you can kind of touch on what's working and what's not working as well during the pandemic. And I think both of you, it'd be great if you could chime in.
Well, I can go first. We're using a lot of phone banking and social media to recruit volunteers. We're hosting virtual events to educate folks. In my experience, the most effective way to organize is to be out there in the field with people in person and have these discussions. So we'll still miss not interacting in person with people, but we will try some creative ways, maybe some creative virtual strategies.
And, Ismael mentioned phone banking and other things like that. One of the things too that you can continually rely on or hope to get is, right, there may not be people knocking on your door during this election cycle, but there will be people calling, and that may be us reminding you to vote. So, and we are definitely always going to be recruiting and looking for volunteers to help with stuff like that.
Yeah, and if you're interested in volunteering, what can people do?
Sign up on our sign up to volunteer on our website. We'll be needing people to phone bank, share educational resources, talk to their family and friends about absentee voting and more. So we're recruiting volunteers. If you want to get involved, just reach out to us.
Ismael, what are some of the other ways that people can get involved from home?
Signing up on our website, reaching out to either me or Roderick, who's our volunteer coordinator. We'd be more than glad to point people in the right direction and put them where they could fit and help us do what we need to do to make sure everybody's out here getting their rights to vote.
And if you sign up for our email list, which you can do also on our website, it says like join our email action list, you'll also get sometimes calls to action we're still having, like if we're collecting petition signatures to deliver to the governor, if we're asking people to email their state legislators or their city council members, depending on what the ask is. So we might have multiple actions running at one point as well, which you can either find during like the take action section of our website or by joining our email list.
Yeah, and if you go to our website at ACLU-MN.org, we have a section right now for advocating from home during COVID that we're updating it. So keep an eye peeled for that and check it out. I know people often are really interested in volunteering, which is exciting always. And right now with people working remotely or having maybe not being able to work as many hours as they might like, this is a great time to really get involved and feel like you're making a difference in difficult times. There are strategies for engaging at home, like petitions and letter writing campaigns or calling an elected official. But I know people can start to wonder, like, does any of it work? Does it really work? So can you give us some hope?
I always think that there's some hope, right? I think that sometimes it's true. It can feel incredibly frustrating to continually, call your legislator and not see as much response. But I say one of the things that I like to tell people is that so much politics is local. And when I mean local, I really mean local. So yes, it can be true. It can be hard to see change happen that you want right now at the congressional level in Washington, D.C. And you may have a hard time ever getting through as you're trying to call a U.S. senator or a U.S. representative. But I think one place we can always look for optimism as hope is like the smaller level down you go. So for example, the legislative session ended this past Monday. I think was officially the end of it. And we got 2 of our 4 priority issues through. The ACLU cared about a lot more than 4 priority issues, clearly, but we kind of strategically had kind of leveraged a couple, and we did get 2 things to happen this session. And part of that was because of the voices of people continually saying we care about these issues, right? The issues we got through were drones and email privacy. And if you look down even at the smaller level, if you're talking about city councils or areas like that, I think a lot of times you can see real room for change and growth when you're talking about someone that you can much more easily get an in-person meeting with, right? Or at this point, a virtual in-person meeting with, or a phone call. So I say keep doing it and try not to just think at the big Washington, D.C. level, think about what changes can be made in my backyard, because I think you're going to find more ability to see the results when you're looking at that level.
And we have a question here from the chat. What is the difference between our system and regular universal mail-in voting? Is it the same thing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we do not have regular universal mail-in voting. We have no excuse absentee voting. I think a couple of the differences are, so first you have to do a request for an absentee ballot, and you fill out a form online. As Ismael mentioned, you have to have some form of proof of identity to request one, a social security number, a ID number associated with a government issued ID. Then a ballot is mailed to you. When you return that ballot, you have to have a witness signature or a notary. And then that ballot is held and it's not counted until a certain number of days before the election. And based on the bill that was just passed, it's 14 days before the election. So it's sealed in like an absentee ballot envelope, which is then opened. And if the signature, it doesn't look like it matches, if it's that, it's rejected. It's not considered a ballot right away. Other places that have a more robust vote by mail system have a multi-tiered way to ensure your vote gets counted earlier, and that it doesn't have the other verification processes that can be barriers, like the signature. So some states that have a more robust vote by mail system have like secure drop boxes where you can just put your ballot right in the drop box, right? That's not something that we have here. There are some states like Oregon that have been vote by mail for quite a while. Other states like Colorado that have a hybrid of both in-person voting locations and a more robust vote by mail system. But the biggest things for ours is that your ballot has more things to go wrong, and kind of a couple of other steps you have to follow, and it has to kind of be weighted to be counted until a certain time frame, because it's because of some of the differences between our state and other vote by mail states.
So this might be a goofy question. It's totally for me. What happens for people like me who have terrible handwriting and their signature looks a little different, you know, all the time, when they go to compare that signature, if it doesn't match quite up, is there a way that I can know that my ballot's been cast or appeal it if they try to deny it?
So you should be able to track it online, track your ballot online. You can go and see how that happens. You should also get a communication if your ballot looks like it's going to be rejected because of a signature match, because you forgot to have the witness signature, for whatever that may be. And you have a certain number of days to remedy that. And you can also vote in person if you know your ballot was rejected, and to try and fix that. But the best way to do it is to track your ballot online, which you can do at the Secretary of State's website, to make sure it was actually accepted.
And we've got a question from the chat here. Are there any initiatives underway to get this universal mail-in voting? What are the obstacles here in Minnesota, and how do we get there?
So the biggest obstacle was that the legislature did not pass a comprehensive vote by mail system, right? So they, as was kind of posed another question, we did pass some provisions in a bill that made our absentee voting system better. It expanded the number of days you could count ballots. So if we get a huge number of ballots, it used to be, I believe, 7 days they had to count them. They added an additional 7 days, so now they have 14 days to open and count the ballots once they're from when they're received. And it added more funding for poll workers and other things like that. But the biggest barrier is that the legislature didn't pass a comprehensive system. There is a lot of kind of questions floating around about whether or not something could happen through executive order or other ways. But the best way that could have happened to be written, the strongest, would have been by a legislative action.
So perhaps future years, as well as all the other things you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Well, we're going to again remind everybody that you can leave your questions in Facebook, and we will get to them as soon as we can. We wanted to talk a little bit about the census tonight and to talk about why it's so important, and also whether or not you still have time to complete yours. So Ismael, can you tell us?
Excuse me. So the census is important because it counts every resident within the United States, and it will also determine how federal funds are located to various communities. The data collected by the census determines the number of seats each state has in the U.S. House of Reps. So in other words, I think it'd be safe to say, Jana, correct me if I'm wrong, the less people in your community that fill out the census, the less amount of representation and funding your community will get.
Exactly right.
And we should talk a little bit about why there's not a citizenship question on the 2020 census, because of course the ACLU played a large role in that. Who wants to jump on that one?
Sure. Yeah, there was the potential for the citizenship question to be on the census. I think a lot of folks maybe saw or heard that in the news, and the ACLU was part of a legal challenge to say, no, you should not put the census question on the census. Sorry, the citizenship question on the census. I think I said that backwards. And the Supreme Court kind of agreed that the manner that the government went about it was not the right way, so it did not make it on the census.
And we have a question here, a follow-up on that. Somebody understandably worried that the census could promote or present dangers for immigrants and non-citizens. So is there anything people should worry about in filling out the census?
Yeah, I definitely get people's worry, but we would still encourage everyone to fill out their census. The census has taken steps about not sharing the information. It does not ask about your citizenship status. It does not ask about information that relates to that. And they do silo the information to protect it. And so if you fill out the census, it's not very long. It does not ask, questions that we don't need to keep repeating it, right, about your citizenship. So I would just encourage everyone to fill it out. I get your hesitation, But I'd also say we've had the census for a long time, and we've consistently seen that there's not much of a privacy risk in filling it out. And it's important to do it because of all the benefits that it brings.
Yeah, it really helps our state. It really does. We want to turn to youth rights here. And we, of course, all know that COVID-19 closed down schools and college campuses all over the country and, of course, across Minnesota. And a lot of young people are feeling really confused about what's going to happen next. So what are some of the unique challenges that young people might be facing? Ismael?
Well, many young people from high school graduates to college graduates are heavily impacted by COVID-19. Pandemic has brought on new challenges that the youth could not anticipate. We know with no known end date in sight, recent college grads that I have personally spoke with are unsure of what the future holds for them, and others are actually considering choosing a new career path.
And I would also add that, you know, there's a problem whether you are, you know, young or you're in high school, college, elementary school, about barriers to access. And what I mean by that is who has access to internet, right? Who has access to a computer? Who has access to be able to complete and do their assignments and their work in a manner that their teachers might expect to be done? And not everyone has equal access. Not only do we see huge disparities between communities of color and wealthier communities, or, you know, poor communities and wealthier communities, around things like lack of access to internet, we also know there's a disparity in rural and urban communities around how strong your broadband is. And in addition, we know that even if you were to have everything, even if you were to have a great internet connection, even if you were to have a tool you need, there's still reasons why most people send their kids to school, right? You need situations and supports in home to help people complete their schoolwork. If you're talking about younger kids, you need a place that you can work. If you live in a family where your parents don't speak English and can't help with the assignments, who's there to help you to make sure you can get it done? If you live in a family where they're essential workers and there's no one there who is home with you, right? Who's going to help you complete your assignments and make sure you get them done? So we wrote to the legislature, you know, talking about some of these problems and joining with other folks, talking about this divide. And another piece that we're looking at and we're monitoring is what are the tools that are being used on a school issued iPad and computer, and how are they, and are there any privacy concerns that, you know, jeopardize students' privacy rights now that everything will be done virtually?
Yeah, I know we pushed pretty hard on that because there was concern about tracking and how the data that might be entered on those devices might be stored. I think that nobody wants to think that these devices kids are using to learn might be spying on them. But it's a realistic concern, and that's why it's one of the things we were pushing on pretty hard this school year. Oh, we've got another question here. Someone said, I was disappointed to see that fines and fees reform did not make it past the legislature this year. So are we. Is the organizing team planning to continue to fight this fight? What's the plan and how can we help?
Sure. First, I'm going to take a step back in case people don't know what fines and fees are. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time working on this session is to try and end the practice of suspending people's driver's license due to unpaid fines and fees. We have tens of thousands of Minnesotans who fall into this category, right? So you can imagine you get a speeding ticket, you can't afford to pay your speeding ticket. Eventually your driver's license might be suspended, and now you have to pay driver's license reinstatement fees, you have to pay on top of your tickets, and now all of a sudden you can't get to work anymore because you couldn't afford that initial $150 ticket because your driver's license has been suspended. Or you continue to drive because you need to in order to provide for your family, and you get a ticket then for driving under a suspended license. So that's a little about the problem. So yeah, we are also disappointed that that bill did not pass this legislative session. However, we're not giving up. And there's a couple of avenues that we can keep pushing this. The first is, as we mentioned before, there's a good chance we're going to have a special session, right? So if the legislature comes back into session in June, which we suspect will happen, in the interim, we're going to be pushing people and legislators to recognize this is an important issue always, and it's even more important now, right? As we know that so many more people's pocketbooks or people's money has to go a lot farther. And the idea that the only thing holding you back from being able to get work or access to work is a driver's license because of fines and fees that you can't afford to pay because you were previously laid off or you're unemployed or whatever it may be, is a barrier that we can eliminate, and the legislature can eliminate with the stroke of a pen.
There's been some building momentum behind this, even among a bunch of our county attorneys lately. So that's exciting, and that's more in terms of driver's license suspension, also over these fees. So that's building as well. One of the cases that we were dealing with was really sad was a young woman who got a ticket and didn't realize she necessarily needed to pay it right away, and also really couldn't afford to because she was new in town. She was trying to save up money for an apartment, and so she let it go for a little bit, got another ticket, got more tickets. That led to a suspended license and then loss of license, and in the end she estimated that one ticket cost her almost $16,000 between fees and fines, and then the really, really expensive insurance people have to get. And it's pretty ridiculous that anyone should have to face that. And I think most of us can understand what a financial struggle that would cause, and especially like Jana's talking about now when times are so incredibly tight. So we're going to keep fighting. Yeah, it's part of the fun of our jobs, I think. Oh, and we've got, we are going to start wrapping up here. So if you've got questions, please get them in pretty quickly. You do still have a little bit of time, just a very tiny bit of time to add it for us in Facebook. But we did want to talk about what youth can do to get involved in community organizing while also practicing social distancing. And I think Jana and Ismael would both be great on this.
You want me to go first, Jana?
Mm-hmm. Go for it.
Well, I would say there are many ways the youth can get involved in community organizing while at the same time practicing social distancing. The biggest way would be by stepping out of their comfort zones and being vocal about the issues affecting them and their peers. Start by talking to friends and family, and also utilize social media. Social media will play the biggest role in reaching people more likely to share similar values with you. So, you know, create a Facebook group, educate people, and recruit them to build energy around the cause.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I also think, you know, if you don't already know, you know, as you're creating this group that Ismael was talking about, figure out who your elected officials are and start getting in dialogue with them about what you want to see them to do. And like I said before, or if you're just tuning in now, I think some of the best people to start out with are not necessarily the president and your senator, US senator. It's who's your city council member, who's your state house member, who's your state senator, right? Those are people who have a much smaller constituent base they need to answer to. And there's actually a incredible amount of change they can affect at that local level.
Yeah, and we've seen that they've been really responsive to people calling, and then when we can get back to visiting again, going in person. They especially love students, we can tell you. So if you're a student, this is a great time. Oh, and of course it couldn't be complete without my dog. So I'm going to just finish up with Lily in the background here. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And we hope that you learned some stuff and enjoyed it as much as we did. We wanted to thank all of our members, our sponsors, our supporters, all the people like you who make our work possible. We couldn't do any of this without you. We could not fight the fight without you. And we're very grateful to all of you. If you'd like to hear this again, or if you want to pass it on to friends who weren't able to make the time slot, it will be up on our Facebook page. And we are collecting questions throughout the week. Next up, we have office hours on Thursday with Ismael Dore, who is our Smart Justice organizer, who will be talking about criminal justice reform. So please join us next week at 4:30, and everybody have a great afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.